A good Passover to you and a happy Holy Week. Happy Holy Week?
Joyous Holy Week? Holy
Solemn
Week?
Holy Week?
Inspiring Holy Week.
Inspiring Holy Week. Excellent. Stories. We gather to listen and to speak. Someone tells a story. Our stories mix and intermingle. We are woven together as friends. This day, this time, is dedicated to stories. Welcome. Peace to each of you. As we gather, we also gather in a time of grief in our community, remembering Lisa Seibert's father, David Bowman-Zook, and Cherie's daughter, Cherise Eggleston, even as we prepare to celebrate the life of Deidre Louise Jones this evening. Peace especially to these friends and to all who are in time of mourning. August, a character in Susan Kidd Monk's novel, The Secret Life of Bees, knows stories. It is Sunday, and the narrator expects the group to go to church. But August and May and June, the three sisters, host a service right there in the Pink House. The group is known as the Daughters and Son of Mary, Black Mary, fist-raised Mary, Mary who came to bring rescue, to bring consolation, to bring freedom, the one known as Our Lady of Chains. And to open the service, August says this: it's been a while since we've told the story of Our Lady of Chains, and since we have visitors who've never heard the story of our statue, I thought we'd tell it again. Really, it's good for all of us to hear it again. Stories have to be told, or they die. And when they die, we can't remember who we are or why we're here. When our stories die, we can't remember who we are or why we're here. Dal Edgerton, from whom we will hear more in a few moments, puts it this way: remembering comes from telling. We remember by telling, and tell in order to remember. Sometimes it may seem as if it were the other way around, that we remember and then tell because we remember. But I believe it is really the telling which comes first. I begin to tell and discover that I am telling, that by telling, I am once again there, where the story is, and that in this land of memory, I can still walk and touch, see, and hear. We begin to tell and discover it is a story we are telling. Perhaps it begins only with an image, a sensation, the thinnest splinter of experience. But the image, by its gravity, draws story around it. Or to say it differently, the strong image provokes one's own need for story. To tell of it, one must begin somehow to set the image in a story. From there, the strong currents of meaning begin to flow. There is story, and it is linked to other stories, and through them to some great story in which these live and move and have their being. An image, a thin splinter of experience, a story small, a story vast. Today we gather around these tables to tell stories, old stories, new stories, shared stories, personal stories, stories of liberation, stories stark, stories tender, stories of pain perhaps, but also of promise. We begin with a question that invites a story. The Passover questions traditionally asked by the children present, the first of which is, how is this night different from all other nights?
This one question has many answers. In fact, the idea is to make so many things different during the Passover Seder precisely so people will ask. And then we get to tell the story. So some of the things that are different, we lounge while eating, luxuriating in our freedom. There are rituals, new and old, that are unique to the occasion. Some people write silly songs or plays to bring the story to life. In North Africa, many families invite the children to take their napkins and sling it over their shoulder and rise up. And the leader of the Seder will say, "Where are you going?" And they'll say, "We're leaving Egypt. We're heading toward Jerusalem." We eat strange foods that remind us of slavery: bitter herbs, salt water for the tears, matzah for the bread that didn't have time to rise as they fled Egypt, matzah that also becomes the bread of liberation toward the end of the Seder by virtue of telling the story. So central to the Seder is the Haggadah, which means the telling. And I brought some of mine. I actually have an embarrassing number, but you can look at them afterwards. They're on the table with the candles lit. It's the book that leads us through the ritual and the remembrance. We tell the story in order to remember, from oppression to liberation. The sages couldn't agree how to tell the story. One sage taught that we should speak of physical oppression. We were slaves in the land of Egypt. Another said, no, it begins with spiritual degradation, that oppression that is inside ourselves. From the beginning, he said, our ancestors worshipped idols. Judaism, as most of you know, embraces multiple perspectives and manifold possibilities of meaning. So, of course, at Seder, in the Haggadah, we mention both of these. And in the end, however, the sages chose to focus on the story that begins before we were slaves, before we had our humanity stripped from us. Deuteronomy 26, verses 5 through 8, only 4 verses. It's the shortest version of the story you'll find. Not to have a short Seder, of course, but to make room for midrash, for questions, for lingering in the open spaces of the story. So here are the verses. My father was a wandering Aramean. He went down to Egypt and sojourned there with meager numbers, and there became a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us. The Midrash here likes to note that the word that means deal harshly also means they made us look bad, right? That's how you justify to a people, to your people, that you're going to oppress some segment of your people. Those people can't be trusted. Those people are bad. They oppressed us. They imposed hard labor upon us. We cried out to the Eternal One, the God of our ancestors, who heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Eternal One freed us from Egypt with a mighty hand, an outstretched arm, and awesome power, with signs and wonders. This is the version of the story that's not told by the slaves. That version from Deuteronomy is told by farmers who were living in the land of promise, the place that was only a dream to those who dared to step a foot into the sea to cross. The farmers were bringing their first fruits to the temple in Jerusalem, and they were instructed to tell this story so that they would never forget their roots, so that they would never forget the ways that God had blessed them, never imagine that they had done all this themselves, never take their privilege for granted. But later, it's the same story that was also told by Jews shivering in European ghettos, praying that the Easter season would not inspire violence against them this time. It was told by Jews crowded in concentration camp barracks. These Jews needed to retell the story of oppression that came to an end. Oppression comes to an end, and God reaches into history for people's liberation. Even before the story of redemption is complete, it hasn't yet been told in the Exodus, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, is already imagining it will be told into the future to remember it. And it says, tell your child on that day. And they're not even free yet, but that's Exodus 13. The rabbis of late antiquity tried to imagine who those children might be. Who's going to receive this story? How will they think about it? And the Haggadah speaks of different children. There's a wise child, one whose intellectual curiosity drives him to want to know everything about it, and a wicked child whose deep skepticism threatens to separate them from the community. We always complain that's not wickedness, that's how we teach, but that's all right. A simple child who might only understand the basics, and one who doesn't even know how to ask. So we have to take the initiative. Knowing that each one of us has some element of all these children inside us, and they come out in different ways and different times, the sages imagined that the story could be told in ways that would touch them all. Jews tell the story in order to remember. Alistair McIntyre taught something similar to what Tao teaches us. He says, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of which story or stories do I find myself a part? In every generation, the Haggadah says, we are obliged to see ourselves as if it's us, not our ancestors who are being freed from Egypt. Our liberation, whatever it be, from social oppression, from trauma, from personal demons, from the imbalance of powers inside our own hearts and minds. And so it's to us that the Hebrew Bible speaks the single command repeated more than any other: you shall not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Storytelling is the heart of empathy.
Thank you, Rachel, for the story, for your story, for the story of your people. I find myself claiming the legacy of that story, but humbly and in gratitude, neither to cover nor to steal, neither to explain away nor to make it fit my own. Monday was the 10th day of April, and as evening fell, it became the 15th day of Nisan in the Jewish calendar. It is the night of the first full moon after the vernal equinox. It makes for a rich week both for Jews and for Christians. I trust communities who follow other paths have special spring observances as well. For Christians of the West, for some centuries, and now is not the time for a history lesson of the calendar, Easter is dated as the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. It moves like Passover. It reminds us of the cosmos, of the movement of the earth and of its moon, the lunar intersecting the solar, grounding us, if we attend to it, in vast ecological rhythms. Easter is the big Sunday. All Sundays, little Easters. But it is not Sunday yet. It is not yet Easter. We dwell in anticipation and in dread, because the road to the empty tomb requires the cross. It is a rich week. From the 4th century, 380 CE, we have a travel diary from a woman, a pilgrim, perhaps a nun, perhaps not. She is Egeria. She travels, among other places, to Jerusalem. She stayed 3 years. She recorded what she did and what she saw. Her observations are our first record of the solidification of practices of this Holy Week, following in Jesus' footsteps along what became to be called the Way of Sorrows. Some of us still follow in this way in our times and places, the Stations of the Cross. 14 pauses in the story of Jesus' passion. 14 strong images around which a story coalesces. Some do this in sanctuaries with icons on the walls. Others do this in the streets, choosing analogous places of torture, pain, and conflict in our neighborhoods to stop and pray for peace. Others of us paraded with palms this past Sunday, with or without the Passion story alongside of it. Fleeting triumph, devastating tragedy, juxtaposed, the stuff of life, and for some, of salvation. Other of us will celebrate a simple meal tomorrow night, a telling and so a remembering of a Last Supper. Still others will engage in a service of shadows, tenebrae, with pauses in the story where Jesus is abandoned, to blow out candles representing various players in the story until his light alone remains and is extinguished. And others will gather around the old rugged cross on Friday to hear Jesus' 7 last words, those phrases he uttered in his last hours, and hear 7 sermons, 1 on each. If you're not doing anything Friday, go to Trinity. 7 amazing African-American women preachers. But take a snack. In any case, 7 last phrases, 7 sermons. And of course the song, "Were you there when they crucified my Lord?" Still others celebrate the Triduum, the great 3 days, one liturgy over 3 evenings. On Thursday, the washing of feet and Eucharist are the focus. On Friday, to adore the cross and share previously consecrated hosts. On Saturday is the vigil, when we gather around the primal fire and light the new Christ candle for the first time. Read and pray and sing across the canon, 9 readings long. Then move on to the font and renew baptismal promises. And finally gather once more to the altar to celebrate the joyous resurrection meal that we have been waiting 40 days to taste. And so we taste and see that God is yet still good, and we sing that the one who was crucified has indeed risen and goes before us. Such is a sample of Holy Week practices. They are all around us. What you do not yet know, you can experience right here in Chicagoland, of course, and of course across the globe. But we have a story to tell. Do you want to stay? Or? Okay. This is not easy to do. I read from the version, the Jewish annotated New Testament. Amy Jill Levine and Jewish colleagues have not only given commentary, but have adjusted the text a bit. But still, when you hear the phrase, the Jews, it doesn't mean all Jews, okay? After Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who betrayed him, also knew this place, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that was to happen to him, came forward and asked, "Whom are you looking for?" And they answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." And Jesus replied, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." And this was to fulfill the word that he had spoken, "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it, struck the high priest's slave, and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple followed Jesus. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest, but Peter was standing outside at the gate. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who guarded the gate, and brought Peter in. The woman said to Peter, You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you? He said, I am not. Now the slaves and the police had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them and warming himself. And then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. And Jesus answered, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all the Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said. When he had said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? And Jesus answered, If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me? Then Annas sent him, bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself, and they asked him, You are not also one of the disciples, are you? And he denied it and said, I am not. One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, Did I not see you in the garden with him? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, the cock crowed. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters, so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered, If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you. And Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law. And the Jews replied, We are not permitted to put anyone to death. This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus and asked him, Are you king of the Jews? Jesus answered, Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me? Pilate replied, I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done? Jesus answered, My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Pilate asked him, So you are a king? Jesus answered, You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice. And Pilate asked him, What is truth? After he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no case against him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the king of the Jews? And they shouted in reply, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was abandoned. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they dressed him in a purple robe. And they kept coming up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and striking him on the face. Pilate went out again and said to them, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him. So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Here is the man. Then the chief priests and the police saw him, and they shouted, Crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him. And the Jews answered him, We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever. He entered his headquarters again and asked Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, Do you refuse to speak to me? Do you not know that I have power to release you and power to crucify you? Jesus answered him, You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about noon. He said to the crowd, "Here is your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate asked him, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but the emperor." And then he handed him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus, and carrying the cross by himself, he went out to the place called the place of the skull, or Golgotha, and there they crucified him, and with him 2 others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Then the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but say, 'This man said, I am the King of the Jews.'" And Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. They also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who will get it." This was to fulfill what the scripture says. "They divided my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots." And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour the disciple took her into his home. After this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, especially because the Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and then of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified, so that you also may believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. And again, another passage of scripture says, "They will look on the one whom they have pierced." After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one because of his fear, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Pilate gave him permission. So he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with spices in linen cloths according to the burial custom of the Jews. Now there was a garden in the place where he was crucified, and in the garden there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so, because it was the Jewish day of preparation, and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. A story.
So good afternoon, peace and blessings. This is the part that the e-community cohort is extremely excited about. We would like for us over the next 20 minutes to engage over questions that matter, stories of liberation that matter. So this is an adapted form of a World Cafe. We don't have the time to do the whole thing, so we'll just do one part of it. We will spend the next 20 minutes with at our tables with a host from the e-community cohort who will be nudging us and guiding us towards staying near the heart of the matter and maybe getting to the heart of the matter. So we want to speak about stories of liberation that means something to us individually, and how we might see ourselves in each other's stories of liberation and how we can be a part of that. And that might be a conversation that each host will guide. For those of us who are watching online, there's a way for you to join the conversation online. So there's a host also, Conway, and there's a link to the table, the online table, on the same page at the bottom. So let's spend the next 20 minutes just engaging with each other. The only rules are that we be truthful and that we be respectful, and that we intend to share a piece of our hearts with each other. Thank you.
Lunch is coming, but not at this conversation. It comes at Tao's story. His story is a story of dining, so we're going to dine while he tells his story. Now we don't have to talk about that.
Yeah, grace and peace be with you all. And lunch be with you all, which is also coming. And that's fine. I'm not going to be disturbed by the clatter. I've sometimes been saved by the clatter of lunch, the clatter of supper, the clatter of breakfast, the clatter of things at midnight even. So a little clattering food is a good sound to my ear. Today I am remembering another Passover, another Holy Week, another table, another meal at another place. The time was 1993, almost 25 years ago now. And the place was Genesis House on the north side of Chicago. Genesis House was a ministry with women seeking to leave prostitution. It was founded by Sister Edwina Gately, who wrote of her experience, called God of the Forest and God of the Street. I was there at Genesis House as a kind of a field ed placement for faculty, because we have some things to learn after all, and hope that I would be able to be of some use to them, and that there would be something that I could learn that would help us in our theological education here at CTS. Genesis House, because it is involved with people, and people who are involved with prostitution, worked both very broadly and very immediately. They had recovery programs, health and nutrition, they had childcare and advocacy, and they had art therapy and AIDS education and social skills and counseling and food pantry and public awareness and education and outreach in the jails and in the bars and on the streets. And the work was done by staff and by volunteers and, of course, by the women themselves. My experience at Genesis House began with meeting with Sharon, the woman who coordinates the volunteers. And I'll confess to being uneasy when I arrived there. Now, I thought, well, I should bring my resume. After all, she needed to find some way to know who I was and how, or even if, I could be of any use. And so I took my resume and tucked it under my arm, and I rang the doorbell. Sharon sat me down at the dining room table. We made mutual introductions, and I waited as she looked over my resume. Now, my resume was a perfectly ordinary one, although I'm not ashamed of it, but it has vital statistics, education, experience, publications, and there was nothing there that I was ashamed of, much I was proud of, but I began to feel uneasy the longer it took her to read my resume. searching, I imagined, for something that might be of use, and the more uncomfortable I became, actually, the more defensive I began to feel. And she turned the pages very slowly, searching. And at none of the entries did she show any sign of response until she came to the last entry on the last page, which was interests and hobbies. Until then, there had been no sign of expression, no change of her expression, no sign of anything, no nodding of the head, no narrowing of the eyes, no arching of the eyebrows, no pursing of the mouth, nothing to indicate interest or possibilities. But when she came to that last entry, she looked up and she said, "You like to cook?" I said, "Yes, I do." She said, "You any good?" I said, "Yes, I'm a good cook." Now, as if whatever sense of embarrassment I had over the rest of my resume had to be compensated for by the defense of my cooking. You know, a cook with attitude, not just a cook. She said, "Well, what kind of food do you cook?" And I said, "Well, all kinds of food, from all over." And she said, "Like where?" I said, "Well, Mexico and Thailand and India." And actually, I was mentally racing along the cookbooks on my shelf, at the kitchen. Vietnam, France, Africa, China. I'd started to say Morocco, but I'd only been looking at that one in the store. Middle Eastern, Greek, Cajun. She said, "Doesn't your wife cook?" I said, "I learned in self-defense." "Can you cook for 20 people?" she asked. "Can you cook for 20 people?" 20 people. Jeez. 20 people. 20? "Oh, sure. Sure." I nodded casually as if I did it all the time. "Oh, sure, 20 people." As if I did it all the time, as if I could do it with one spoon tied behind my back. Okay. Sharon explained how they had a hospitality night every Thursday, and not only residents who were there at Genesis House, but guests and other volunteers came, and they liked to have something special for supper that night, something to give a sense of welcome and hospitality. She said, "You could cook on hospitality nights a couple times a month, and you could help us with the subsidized food pickup down at the Water Street Market. How about that?" "Sure," I said. "Sure." There was at least something. I was glad there was at least one thing I could do. So for the first meal I cooked, I decided upon something Mexican, and I rubbed some pork loins with chili paste, and I'd roast them and slice them thin and put them on a bed of lentils seasoned mostly with chorizo and onions and tomatoes and cilantro, and there'd be a big salad of mixed vegetables and a lime dressing and some warm tortillas and fresh pineapple for dessert. And as I worked out in the kitchen, people would wander in and wander out. I introduced myself, responded to questions about what was for dinner. One woman asked if I was a chef. I said, "No, I'm a teacher." She said, "Where do you teach?" I told her. She thought about that. "That's nice," she said. That's mostly the way it went. Everyone was polite. Most were content to make small talk about the food and leave it at that. As I stood sort of stirring my pots and steaming my veggies, nobody asked me to interpret some obscure passage of the Bible. No one asked me to explain a particular point of Christian doctrine. No one asked me for counsel. or seemed particularly interested in much except the food that I was preparing. And it made sense, of course. It made perfect sense. Relationships take time, and who the hell is this guy anyway? Because you look at me and I could be anybody, right? I could be the John. I could be the pimp. I could be the battering boyfriend. I could be the abusive father. I could be the judge. I could be the cop. I could be the dealer. I could just be another person who doesn't give a damn. Sharon told me my role was to do something simple and real and easy to understand without any explanations, without any words even. She said, you're here to feed somebody. Get it? And be trustworthy about it. That's what you're supposed to do. So that's how my work at Genesis House proceeded, through racks of Indonesian grilled chicken and platters of spaghetti with bolognese sauce and cool Indian raitas and gumbo and dirty rice and banana stewed in coconut milk. And sometimes sitting at the table, people would talk about places where the food had come from and friends who came from there too. And sometimes people would find food from their own homes honored at the table. And they would talk about wonderful dishes and meals that they had known. Once I was making a big mixed salad to accompany a Thai fried rice with seafood, and I was assembling, well, the salad was to have like green and red cabbage and tomatoes and green beans and sweet red peppers and bean sprouts and carrots and radishes and cucumbers and whatever else I could find on sale at Jewel's. And the dressing would be sweet and salty and sour, so it would have sugar and fish sauce and lime juice. It would be fragrant with mint and cilantro, and it would be pungent with garlic and shallots, and it would be enriched with crushed peanuts. And the ingredients were encamped in various corners of the kitchen, the workspace being small. And a young woman came in and watched for a while. I was sitting, trimming, peeling, slicing at the table, and she offered to help. So we sat there working together, mostly in silence. We exchanged names. She said she was just there for a few days until some program opened up. She said she was 19. I'd guessed 15, if that. She started asking questions about cooking, about why things were done this way or that way. We talked about peeling broccoli and how to steam the stems and the florets so they both came out crisp. We talked about how to score the edge of a cucumber skin so that it made a pretty pattern on the slices. Well, when the vegetables were all ready, I asked her to put it all on the platter while I attended to the rice and seafood on the stove, and I was pretty occupied for a few minutes, so I didn't see what was going on behind my back. I turned to find her bent over the table, shaping the brightly colored vegetables into a beautiful design on the platter. She was arranging dark against light and bright against pale and overlapping rings like the scales of a fish, and minutely adjusting the edge garnish so it looked like the frame of a mosaic. I just planned on mixing it all together. Right? I told her I thought she'd made a lovely presentation. She said it was fun. Went back to watch TV. When the time for supper came, I asked her to bring the salad in so everyone could see it in her hands. And so she could see it in her hands. Put it on the table. And that's the way it went. But after several months, on Monday of Holy Week, Sharon called. Hospitality that week was Maundy Thursday, and I wasn't scheduled to cook that night, somebody else was, but she wondered if I could come and lead a service at the table. Well, by this time I'd been cooking there for 6 months, and I always looked forward to going, and I knew what my place was. My place was in the kitchen and at the table, and I was happy for that. Now, however, Sharon was asking me to do something that was part of what I do, part of my profession, my expertise. She was asking me to prepare a liturgy, not a meal. And I was delighted. I thought Maundy Thursday would be a wonderful service to adapt to the table. I said I'd be honored to help and asked what she had in mind. A Passover Seder, she said. They'd done something like that before, and the women had really appreciated it. A Passover Seder. A Seder? A Seder? I thought I would be doing a service I knew how to do. But a Seder. I'd have to find different Passover Haggadot. I'd have to study them. I'd have to adapt them to the time and the setting and the fact that neither I nor anyone who was likely to be there was Jewish. What about the platter, the Passover platter? You know, the lamb bone and the matzah and the bitter herbs. The director would take care of that, Sharon told me. Will you do it? Sure. I do it all the time. For 20 people. So that week I scrambled around to try to find the right resources. And the most important thing seemed to me to be to find a way to tell the story of liberation and to enact the heart of the ritual. To tell the story of liberation and to enact the heart of the ritual. We hear the story with our ears. We taste it, we touch it, we see it, we smell it, we eat it with our whole bodies. And as I read these texts at my desk, I knew that it was important that we say some of these words, word for word. Recite them word for word. And I knew that they would sound, but I didn't know how they would sound at our table at Genesis House. The night came, the table was set, the plates were arranged, we told the story together, the story of captivity and escape. We recited some of the great words. This is the bread of poverty. Let all who are hungry enter and eat. This year, we are slaves. Next year, may we be free. Let all who are needy come to our Passover feast. I do not think that I imagined this when the words were spoken. We who were sitting there knew who they were about. Whoever else they were about us. Sitting there. They were about the women sitting there and me sitting there. And whoever else they were about those women who were not at the table because they still dwelt in the house of bondage. And everyone could call out their names. Another Holy Week, another Passover, another meal at another table, another story to join to our stories, our tables, our meals. And by telling, to remember the freedom that is yet to come, always to remember the freedom that is yet to come. Always to remember the freedom that is yet to come. Remember. Grace and peace be with you all.
Good afternoon. I am Tiffany Trent. One of my practices that this house has always welcomed me to share comes from Theater of the Oppressed, and to harvest the sharing that you all have done around your tables, I would like to escort us through a little bit of Theater of the Oppressed image work, where we might emerge some revelation. So I'll share with you a couple of the guidelines. The exercise will be silent. That's the first one. Our bodies carry our stories of liberation. Our bodies carry our stories. And there are meanings that we don't have words for. There is depth of expression where language fails, where our languages are different, where, as some shared at my table, the language of the faith was different from the language I even speak. And so our bodies will speak for us. I encourage you to take care of yourselves, be gentle with yourselves, and at your table, the question that you're building a tableau, an image of with your bodies is, how are your stories of liberation intertwined? If you need to step away from your table towards the window or to an empty space, and I'm going to give you a minute. So someone will put themselves in an experience maybe of exodus, of liberation, of freedom, or something else that you would like to embody of the freedom from or freedom toward, and build your picture with the members of your table. I'll give you some time warnings, and then I'll give further instruction. So I encourage your group to find a space to begin. It is a silent exercise. You can talk to each other about where you might find space so that you can agree on where to go. But once you begin to build, you're building a tableau of how the stories you shared might intertwine. If you have an idea beyond your own body to contribute, you might use your hand like a paintbrush or puppet strings. If you'd like to guide one of your neighbors in any particular way, as an example, that way we can keep ourselves safe and respect our personal boundaries. If you need to sculpt. Observe, see if you want to tweak, and then re-enter. Feel free. I hear some voices. I encourage you to trust that the body knows. tweak or if you're happy with it. Memorize where you are. Memorize where you are so that you could come back to it. Just make sure you know exactly where you are in relationship to everyone else in your group. All right, and since we have 7 groups, I'm going to ask that these 3 groups here, 1, 2, 3, stay where you are, and the other 4 groups, relax for a moment. Relax and take in the images of intertwined liberation from these 3 groups. If you want to walk towards them, feel free to look at the sculptures more closely. And they may look different depending on where you are. So cross behind them, see a different person's face, may give you a completely different perspective on the image. And so I'm going to start with this group, and if we could just get verbs, a verb for what could be happening in this intertwined story of liberation, a verb.
Healing.
Healing? Did I get that right? Healing? Healing could be happening here. What else do you see? A verb. What could be happening here?
Supplication.
Supplication. Supplication. Healing. Supplication. Let's get one more. Let's try to get 3. Fighting. Fighting. Healing, supplication, and fighting. Thank you. You all can relax here. Let's get some verbs for this next group. What is happening? What could be happening? Unifying. Praying. Unifying, praying. Channeling. Wow. Unifying, praying, and channeling. Thanks, you. Birthing. Birthing. Amen. Thank you. And this group, let's get some verbs for what could be happening in this story of liberation. Calling. Calling. I didn't hear it. Contemplation. Contemplating. Calling. Contemplating. Seeing. Blessing. Oh, wow. Yeah, it definitely is telegraphing a sort of a big step lies ahead. Amen. Thank you. You all can relax. Would the other groups rebuild so that we might give a verbal name to what's emerging? And now those first 3 groups, please check out. Yeah, observe. Something good said. Sometimes our bodies speak for us. They carry the journey. They carry the testimony. And they witness, whether our own stories or being present for someone else's. And together, we continue to remember, we continue to conquer, we continue to forge ahead. Grace and peace.
The blessing of the name, the blessing of the face, the blessing of the voice, the blessing of the glory, the blessings of the weight, the blessings of the presence be with you all, now and always. Amen.